It was a cold winter morning, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of early traffic. She was on her way to work, bundled up in a thick coat, her breath visible in the frosty air. As she walked past the park, she noticed a man sitting on a bench near the entrance. He looked disheveled, his clothes worn and tattered, and his face hidden beneath a scruffy beard. A tattered blanket was draped over his shoulders, and he held a small cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." She had seen him there before, always in the same spot, always silent. Most people walked past without a second glance, but something about him caught her attention. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, as if the world around him didn't exist. Or maybe it was the faint glimmer in his eyes, something that didn't quite match the image of a man down on his luck. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a few coins. Walking over, she dropped them into the old cup he had placed at his feet. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was a quiet dignity in his gaze, something that made her pause. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice surprisingly clear and steady. She nodded, offering a small smile before continuing on her way. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than met the eye. Over the next few days, she found herself glancing at him every time she passed the park. He was always there, always in the same spot, always silent. She started to wonder about his story. How had he ended up here? Did he have family? Friends? Why did he seem so different from the others she had seen on the streets? One morning, she decided to do something she had never done before. Instead of just dropping coins into his cup, she stopped and spoke to him. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "I see you here every day. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might not answer. But then he nodded slowly. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you for asking." His words were polite, but there was a distance in his tone, as if he didn't want to engage further. She hesitated, unsure of what to say next. But something inside her urged her to keep trying. "My name's, well, you can call me Anna," she said, using a name she often gave to strangers. "What's yours?" He studied her for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, he said, "You can call me John." It was a simple exchange, but it felt like a small victory. She smiled and nodded. "Nice to meet you, John. I'll see you around." As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. There was something about him that didn't add up. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would end up on the streets. His words were measured, his demeanor calm and composed. It was as if he carried a secret, something hidden beneath the surface. Over the next few weeks, she made it a point to stop and talk to him whenever she could. At first, their conversations were brief and superficial. She would ask how he was doing, and he would give short, polite answers. But slowly, he began to open up. One day, as she handed him a cup of hot coffee she had bought from a nearby cafe, he looked at her with a hint of gratitude. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she replied. "But I want to." He took a sip of the coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "You're different," he said after a moment. "Most people don't care." His words struck a chord with her. She had always believed in kindness, in helping others whenever she could. But hearing him say that made her realize how rare such gestures had become. "Everyone has a story," she said softly. "I'd like to hear yours, if you're willing to share." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. But then he nodded. "Maybe one day," he said. It was a small step, but it was enough to keep her coming back. She started bringing him food, warm clothes, and even books to pass the time. He never asked for anything, but he always accepted her offerings with quiet gratitude. One afternoon, as she sat on the bench beside him, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Beneath the layers of dirt and grime, his hands were clean, his nails neatly trimmed. It was a small detail, but it added to the mystery surrounding him. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice gentle. "I can tell." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared off into the distance, as if lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns," he said. "You never know where you'll end up." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but she could sense that he wasn't ready to share. So she simply nodded, respecting his silence. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. She began to look forward to their conversations, to the quiet moments they shared on that park bench. And though she still didn't know his full story, she felt a deep connection to him, a sense of trust that went beyond words. Little did she know, the truth about him would soon come to light, changing everything she thought she knew. The days grew colder, and the park became quieter as people preferred to stay indoors. But she continued her routine, stopping by the bench every morning to check on him. Their conversations grew longer, and he began to share small glimpses of his past. One morning, as she handed him a warm scarf she had knitted over the weekend, he looked at her with a faint smile. "You're too kind," he said, wrapping the scarf around his neck. "Most people wouldn't bother." She shrugged, sitting down beside him. "I don't see it as a bother. I like talking to you. You're different." He chuckled softly, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. "Different, huh? In what way?" She thought for a moment. "You don't complain. You don't ask for much. And you've got this calmness about you. Like you've seen a lot but still manage to stay grounded." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. "Life has a way of teaching you things. Sometimes the hard way." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you have family? Anyone who might be looking for you?" His expression darkened for a moment, and she immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he replied after a pause. "I had a family once. But things didn't work out." She wanted to ask more, but she could tell he wasn't ready to elaborate. Instead, she changed the subject. "Do you like reading? I brought you a book last week. Did you get a chance to look at it?" He nodded, his face lighting up slightly. "I did. It was interesting. Thank you." She smiled, glad to see him engaged. "I can bring you more if you'd like. What kind of books do you enjoy?" He thought for a moment. "Anything, really. But I've always liked stories about people overcoming challenges. It's inspiring." She made a mental note to bring him more books with uplifting themes. As they sat there, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was one of those rare moments where words weren't necessary, and the connection felt deeper than anything they could say. One afternoon, as she was about to leave, he suddenly spoke up. "You've been very kind to me," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." She shook her head. "You don't have to repay me. Just knowing you're okay is enough." He looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said softly. "Someone special?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He nodded. "My daughter. She was about your age when I last saw her." Her heart ached at the sadness in his voice. "What happened?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak. "I made mistakes. Big ones. I lost everything because of them. My family, my home, my dignity. I've been trying to make amends, but some things can't be fixed. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. It's never too late to try. Maybe your daughter would understand if she knew how much you regret it. He shook his head. I don't know. It's been so long. She probably doesn't even remember me. I'm sure she does, she said gently. A father's love leaves a mark, no matter what. He didn't respond, but she could see the tears glistening in his eyes. It was the first time he had shown such vulnerability, and it made her realize just how much he had been carrying inside. Over the next few days, she noticed a change in him. He seemed more open, more willing to share. He told her about his love for music, how he used to play the guitar and write songs. He even hummed a tune one morning, his voice surprisingly melodic. You're really good, she said, impressed. You should play again. He smiled faintly. Maybe one day. If I ever get the chance. She didn't know what he meant by that, but she didn't press him. Instead, she focused on the small joys they shared, the warmth of the coffee she brought him, the laughter that occasionally broke through his solemn demeanor, and the quiet companionship that had become a part of their daily routine. But as much as she enjoyed their time together, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, it all hinted at a life that was far more complex than it seemed. One evening, as she was leaving the park, she noticed a man in a suit standing near the bench, watching him from a distance. The man looked out of place, his sharp attire contrasting with the casual surroundings. She hesitated, wondering if she should say something, but before she could, the man turned and walked away. It was a small moment, but it left her with a sense of unease. Who was that man? And why was he watching him? The next morning, when she arrived at the park, he wasn't there. The bench was empty, and his usual spot felt strangely vacant. She waited for a while, hoping he would show up, but he didn't. As she walked to work, her mind raced with questions. Where had he gone? Was he okay? And why did she feel such a deep sense of loss at his absence? Little did she know, the answers to her questions would soon reveal a truth that would change everything. The next few days passed, and the bench remained empty. She couldn't stop thinking about him. Where had he gone? Had something happened? She asked around the park, but no one seemed to know. The regular joggers and dog walkers shrugged when she mentioned him. He was just another homeless guy, one man said dismissively. But to her, he was so much more than that. One evening, after work, she decided to take a different route home, hoping to spot him somewhere nearby. As she walked through the quieter streets, her eyes scanned every corner, every alley. Just as she was about to give up, she saw him. He was sitting on the steps of an old, abandoned building, his head bowed. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by concern. He looked even more disheveled than usual, his face pale and drawn. "Hey," she called out softly as she approached. He looked up, startled. For a moment, he seemed almost unrecognizable, his eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or exhaustion. But then he recognized her, and a faint smile touched his lips. "You found me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was worried about you," she replied, sitting down beside him. "Are you okay? Why did you leave the park?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. "I had to move. It wasn't safe there anymore." "Not safe? What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his tattered blanket tighter around himself, as if trying to shield himself from more than just the cold. "There are people looking for me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Her heart skipped a beat. "What kind of people? Are you in trouble?" He shook his head. "It's complicated. I can't explain it all right now. But I need to stay hidden for a while." She wanted to press him for more details, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich she had packed for lunch. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while." He accepted it gratefully, his hands trembling as he unwrapped it. "Thank you," he said, taking a small bite. "You've been so kind to me. I don't deserve it." "Everyone deserves kindness," she replied firmly. "And you're not alone in this, whatever it is. If you need help, I'm here." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said. "It's better if you stay away." "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. "You're my friend, and I care about you. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out together." For a moment, he seemed to waver, as if considering whether to trust her. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I used to be someone else," he began, his voice low. "Someone important. But I made mistakes, big ones. I lost everything because of them. And now, there are people who want to make sure I stay lost." Her mind raced with questions, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "I've been trying to stay off the radar," he said. "But it's getting harder. They're getting closer." "Who are they?" she asked gently. He shook his head. "I can't tell you that. It's too dangerous. The less you know, the better." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she could handle it, but she could see the fear in his eyes. Instead, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But promise me one thing. If you need help, any kind of help, you'll let me know. Don't try to face this alone." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I promise." As she walked home that night, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who was he really? What had he done to end up like this? And who was after him? She didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear, she wasn't going to give up on him. Whatever his past held, she believed he deserved a chance to make things right. Little did she know, the truth was far more extraordinary than she could have ever imagined. The days that followed were tense. She visited him every evening, bringing food, warm clothes, and whatever else she thought might help. He was cautious, always looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook when he spoke. One evening, as they sat on the steps of the abandoned building, she decided to broach the subject again. "You can't keep living like this," she said gently. "There has to be a way out. Maybe we can find help, someone who can protect you." He shook his head. "It's not that simple. The people after me, they're powerful. They have connections everywhere. If I reach out to the wrong person, it could make things worse." She frowned, her mind racing. "What about your daughter? You mentioned her before. Maybe she could help." His face softened at the mention of his daughter, but then he looked away. "I haven't seen her in years. She probably doesn't even want to see me. And even if she did, I wouldn't want to drag her into this. But she might be the only one who can help you," she insisted. "You said she was about my age. Maybe she'd understand. Maybe she'd want to help." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally, he sighed. "I don't even know where she is anymore. After everything that happened, I lost touch with her." She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "Let me help you find her. We can start small, maybe look her up online or something. You never know." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right. But you have to be careful. If anyone finds out what you're doing, it could put you in danger." She smiled, trying to reassure him. "I'll be careful. I promise." That night, she went home and started her search. She didn't have much to go on, just his first name and the fact that he had a daughter about her age. But she was determined. She spent hours scrolling through social media, searching for any clues that might lead her to his daughter. After several days of searching, she finally found something. A woman in her late 20s had posted a photo with a caption that read, "Missing my dad every day. Wish I could see him again." The woman's name matched the one he had mentioned in passing, and there was a striking resemblance in their eyes. Excited, she showed him the photo the next evening. "Is this her?" she asked, holding out her phone. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Yes," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's her." She could see the emotions swirling in his eyes, relief, guilt, longing. "I'll reach out to her," she said. "I'll explain everything. She deserves to know you're okay." He nodded, but there was fear in his eyes. "Be careful what you say. If anyone finds out." "I know," she said firmly. "I'll be discreet." That night, she sent a message to the woman, keeping it vague but heartfelt. "Hi, I think I might know your father. He's safe, but he needs your help. Can we talk?" The response came the next morning. "Who are you? How do you know my dad?" She took a deep breath and replied, "I'm a friend. He's been through a lot, but he misses you. Can we meet?" There was a long pause before the woman responded. "Meet me at this cafe tomorrow at noon. Don't bring him. I need to know this is real." She showed him the messages, and he agreed to let her go alone. "Be careful," he said, his voice filled with worry. The next day, she arrived at the cafe, her heart pounding. She spotted the woman immediately. She looked just like her photo, but there was a hardness in her eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. "Hi," she said, approaching the table. "Thank you for meeting me." The woman nodded, her expression cautious. "Start talking." And so, she did. She told her everything, how she had met him, how he had opened up about his past, and how he was in danger. The woman listened in silence, her face unreadable. When she finished, the woman leaned back in her chair, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "If this is true," she said slowly, "then my father has been hiding for a long time. And if he's in trouble, it's because of something big." She nodded. "I don't know all the details, but I believe he wants to make things right. He just needs your help." The woman was silent for a long time, then finally spoke. "All right. I'll meet him. But if this is some kind of trick." "It's not," she said firmly. "He's your father, and he needs you." As she left the cafe, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a way out for him. But little did she know, the meeting would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The day of the meeting arrived, and she could feel the tension in the air. He was nervous, pacing back and forth in the small, dimly lit room of the abandoned building where he had been staying. She tried to reassure him, but it was clear that the thought of facing his daughter after all these years was overwhelming. "What if she hates me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if she doesn't want anything to do with me?" "She agreed to meet you," she said gently. "That's a good sign. She wouldn't have come if she didn't care." He nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. She handed him a clean shirt she had brought for him, hoping it would help him feel more presentable. He changed quickly, running a hand through his hair in a futile attempt to tidy it. "You'll be fine," she said, giving him an encouraging smile. "Just be honest with her. She deserves to hear your side of the story." They made their way to the cafe where his daughter had agreed to meet them. She could feel his anxiety growing with every step, but she stayed by his side, offering silent support. When they arrived, his daughter was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked up as they approached, her expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with tension, the weight of years of separation hanging between them. Finally, his daughter broke the silence. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes filling with tears. Yes, it's me. She stared at him, her face a mixture of emotions, shock, anger, relief. Where have you been? She asked, her voice cracking. Do you have any idea how much I've missed you? He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I never wanted to leave you. But I had no choice. No choice, she repeated, her voice rising. You disappeared without a word. Do you know how hard that was for me? For Mom? He flinched at the mention of his ex-wife, but he didn't defend himself. Instead, he took a deep breath and began to explain. I made mistakes, he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. Big ones. I got involved in something I shouldn't have, and it cost me everything. I lost my job, my home, my family. I thought if I stayed away, I could protect you. But I was wrong. I see that now. His daughter listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Why now? She asked. Why are you reaching out after all these years? He glanced at her, then at the woman who had brought them together. Because I realized I can't keep running, he said. I need to face my past, no matter how painful it is. And I need your help. His daughter was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the table. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I've spent years wondering what happened to you, she said. Wondering if you were even alive. And now you're here, asking for my help. Do you have any idea how hard this is for me? He nodded, his own tears spilling over. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I hope you can understand why I did what I did. She took a deep breath, then reached across the table and took his hand. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, she said. But I'm willing to try. For now, that's enough. He squeezed her hand, his face filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said. That's more than I deserve. As they sat there, the tension slowly began to ease. They talked for hours, catching up on the years they had lost. She watched from a distance, giving them space but staying close enough to offer support if they needed it. By the time they left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. He turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said. For everything. I couldn't have done this without you. She smiled, feeling a sense of relief and hope. You're welcome. But this is just the beginning. There's still a lot to figure out. He nodded, his expression serious. I know. And I'm ready to face it. Whatever comes next, I'm not running anymore. As they walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had taken the first step toward redemption, and she had been there to help him. But little did they know, the challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The reunion with his daughter marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, they worked together to piece together the fragments of his life. His daughter, though still guarded, was willing to help. She had resources and connections he no longer had, and she used them to start unraveling the mess he had left behind. One evening, the three of them sat in her small apartment, surrounded by papers and notes. His daughter had been digging into his past, and what she found was both shocking and overwhelming. You were involved in some serious stuff, she said, her voice tense as she flipped through a stack of documents. Corporate fraud, embezzlement. Dad, do you realize how much trouble you're still in? He nodded, his face pale. I know. I've been running from it for years. But I can't keep hiding. I need to make things right. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's not going to be easy. The people you worked with, they're powerful. And they're not going to let you just walk away. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm ready to face the consequences. But I need your help to do it the right way. I don't want to drag anyone else down with me. His daughter exchanged a glance with her, then nodded. All right. We'll figure this out together. But you have to be honest with me. No more secrets. No more secrets, he promised. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly. His daughter reached out to legal contacts, trying to find a way for him to come forward without putting himself in immediate danger. She helped where she could, offering emotional support and keeping him focused, and the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. One night, as they sat in the apartment after a long day, he turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You've done so much for me, and I don't deserve it. She shook her head. You don't have to thank me. I just want to see you get through this. You're a good person, and you deserve a second chance. He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in his eyes. I hope I can live up to that. As the days passed, the pieces began to fall into place. His daughter found a lawyer willing to take on his case, someone who specialized in high-stakes corporate disputes. They started building a defense, gathering evidence to show that while he had made mistakes, he had also been manipulated by those higher up in the organization. But the process was grueling. There were days when he seemed to shrink under the weight of it all, his confidence wavering. On those days, she and his daughter worked together to keep him going, reminding him of the progress they had made and the future they were fighting for. One afternoon, as they were reviewing a particularly complex document, his daughter suddenly looked up, her expression serious. Dad, she said, there's something you need to know. The people you used to work with, they've been keeping tabs on you. They know you've been talking to us. He froze, his face draining of color. How do you know? I've been monitoring their communications, she said. They're planning something. I don't know what yet, but it's not good. She felt a chill run down her spine. What do we do? His daughter hesitated, then said, we need to move quickly. If we can present our case before they make their move, we might have a chance. He nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. Then let's do it. I'm not running anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. They worked around the clock, finalizing their case and preparing for what lay ahead. It was exhausting, but there was a sense of purpose that kept them going. Finally, the day came when they were ready to present their case. As they stood outside the lawyer's office, he turned to them, his eyes filled with emotion. Whatever happens, he said, I want you both to know how grateful I am. You've given me a chance to make things right, and I'll never forget that. His daughter hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. We're in this together, Dad. No matter what. She watched them, feeling a swell of pride and hope. They had come so far, and whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. But as they stepped into the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The meeting with the lawyer was intense. For hours, they went over every detail of his case, every piece of evidence they had gathered. The lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman, listened carefully, asking pointed questions and making notes. This is going to be an uphill battle, she said finally, leaning back in her chair. The people you're up against have deep pockets and powerful connections. But we have a strong case, especially if we can prove you were coerced into participating in their schemes. He nodded, his face serious. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to make things right. The lawyer studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. We'll need you to be completely transparent. No more hiding, no more secrets. If we're going to win this, we need to be one step ahead of them. He agreed, and they spent the rest of the day going over the next steps. By the time they left the office, they were all exhausted but hopeful. That night, as they sat in the apartment, his daughter turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Dad, she said, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. Why did you stay away for so long? Why didn't you reach out sooner? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I thought I was protecting you, he said. I thought if I stayed away, you and your mom would be safe. But I see now that I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I should have fought for you. His daughter nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions. I wish you had, she said softly. But I'm glad you're here now. He reached out and took her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. Me too. Over the next few days, they continued to prepare for the legal battle ahead. His daughter used her connections to gather more evidence, while she helped him stay focused and positive. It was a team effort, and they were all determined to see it through. But the stress was taking its toll. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, as the weight of everything he had been through pressed down on him. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the constant battle between hope and fear. One evening, as they sat in the apartment, she turned to him, her voice gentle. How are you holding up? She asked. He hesitated, then sighed. I don't know, he admitted. Some days, I feel like I can do this. Other days, I feel like I'm drowning. She nodded, understanding. It's a lot to carry. But you're not alone. We're here for you, every step of the way. He looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness, he said. But I'm so grateful for it. She smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. You don't have to deserve it. That's not how kindness works. As the days passed, they grew closer, the bond between them strengthening. They shared stories, laughed together, and supported each other through the tough moments. It was a strange and unexpected family, but it worked. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. They dressed carefully, wanting to make a good impression. As they stood outside the courthouse, he turned to them, his face filled with determination. Whatever happens today, he said, I want you both to know how much you mean to me. You've given me a second chance, and I'll never forget that. His daughter hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. We're in this together, Dad. No matter what. She watched them, feeling a swell of pride and hope. They had come so far, and whatever the outcome, they had already won something precious, each other. As they stepped into the courthouse, she took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. He sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer and his daughter. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding. The stakes were high, and everyone in the room knew it. The prosecution presented their case first, painting him as a willing participant in the corporate fraud that had cost so many people their livelihoods. They called witnesses, presented documents, and made their arguments with precision and confidence. It was hard to listen to, and she could see the strain on his face as the accusations piled up. When it was their turn, his lawyer stood and began to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. She presented evidence showing how he had been coerced into participating, how he had tried to back out but was threatened into silence. She called witnesses who testified to his character, his kindness, and his regret. Finally, it was his turn to speak. He stood, his hands trembling slightly, and faced the judge. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt people, and I will carry that guilt with me for the rest of my life. But I want to make things right. I want to take responsibility for my actions and do whatever I can to repair the damage I've caused. He paused, taking a deep breath. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to make amends. To be the person my family deserves. To be the person I know I can be. The courtroom was silent as he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She felt tears prick her eyes, her heart swelling with pride. No matter what happened, she knew he had done the right thing by facing his past and speaking his truth. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded and called for a recess to consider the case. As they waited, the tension in the room was palpable. She sat with his daughter, their hands clasped tightly together, both of them praying for a positive outcome. Finally, the judge returned and called the court to order. He looked at him, his expression serious. "This is a difficult case," the judge began. "There is no doubt that you made serious mistakes, and those mistakes had significant consequences. However, it is also clear that you have taken steps to make amends and that you are genuinely remorseful for your actions." He paused, and she held her breath, her heart pounding. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I am sentencing you to probation and community service. You will work with the victims of the fraud to help them recover what they lost, and you will continue to cooperate with the authorities in their investigation. If you fulfill these obligations, your record will be expunged, and you will have the chance to start anew." The relief in the room was palpable. His daughter hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. She felt a surge of joy and gratitude, knowing that he had been given a second chance. As they left the courthouse, he turned to them, his eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with tears. "I couldn't have done this without you." His daughter smiled, her face radiant with relief. "We're just glad you're getting the chance to make things right." She nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you, but we'll be here to help." He smiled, his face filled with determination. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes, I'm going to make things right." As they walked away from the courthouse, she felt a sense of hope and possibility. They had faced the past and come out stronger on the other side. But little did they know, the challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, he threw himself into his community service, working tirelessly to help those who had been affected by the fraud. It wasn't easy, many people were understandably wary of him, and some outright refused to accept his help. But he didn't let that deter him. He kept showing up, day after day, determined to make a difference. She and his daughter supported him every step of the way. They helped him organize fundraisers, connect with resources, and rebuild trust within the community. Slowly but surely, people began to see the change in him. They saw his sincerity, his dedication, and his willingness to take responsibility for his actions. One evening, as they sat in the apartment after a long day, he turned to them, his face filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. "You've given me a second chance, and I'll never forget that." His daughter smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "We're just glad to see you happy, Dad. You've come so far." She nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "You've worked hard for this. You deserve it." As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. He found a small apartment and started rebuilding his life, one step at a time. He reconnected with old friends, mended broken relationships, and even started playing the guitar again. The joy in his eyes was unmistakable, and it filled her with a sense of fulfillment. One day, as they were walking through the park where they had first met, he turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I realized something." "What's that?" she asked, curious. "That sometimes, the hardest thing to do is also the right thing," he said. "Facing my past, taking responsibility for my actions, it wasn't easy. But it was worth it. And I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "You did the hard part. I just gave you a little push." He shook his head. "It was more than that. You believed in me when no one else did. You saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. And for that, I'll always be grateful." They walked in silence for a while, the park bustling with life around them. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and birdsong. As they reached the bench where they had first met, he stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "This is where it all started," he said. "Where you saw me as more than just a homeless man. Where you gave me a chance." She nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "And look how far you've come." He smiled, his face radiant with joy. "I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for seeing me. For believing in me." She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're welcome. But you did the hard part. You chose to change. You chose to make things right." He nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "And I'll keep choosing that, every day. No matter what." As they stood there, the park bustling with life around them, she felt a deep sense of peace. They had faced the past, overcome incredible challenges, and come out stronger on the other side. And as they walked away from the bench, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together.